The ACC and the Big 12 are destined to be behind the Big 10 and the SEC, but what if they make like the Avengers and join forces?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching, carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. We'll talk about LSU. What do they need going into spring football with their spring game looming next Saturday in Baton Rouge? Caroline Fenton of Locked On LSU will join us. And the best coaching turnaround that nobody noticed. Yeah, that's all coming up on today's show. Let's start with the ACC and Big 12. What if they just, for those listening on podcast, that was the expression or sound that I made when I meshed my hands together. What if they just joined forces, right? I mean, it always looks fun in the Avengers movies back in, the OG Marvel days where, you got Iron Man and Captain America and Thor and Hulk and Black Widow and Hawkeye, and then you work in a bunch of other characters like War Machine and, everybody else in the MCU, Doctor Strange and the like. Does it work that way? Not exactly, because the problem that the Big 12 and the ACC face separate is the same one that they face if they were to undergo a massive merger and go together. Number one, the ACC grant of rights would certainly get complicated. Now, ESPN is a partner in both of those deals. They're the exclusive rights holder for the ACC, and they're a majority rights holder of the Big 12 under their new media deal that Brett Yormark negotiated and such, and allowed for them to add schools from a power conference at essentially the same rate, and everyone still gets roughly the same payout after they've added the 4 former Pac-12 schools, RIP. And I think that for the ACC and the Big 12, in theory, it sounds like a really good, fun idea. But in reality, certainly the logistics would be complicated, though I don't think impossible to try and figure out. I mean, we've got Stanford, Cal, and SMU in the ACC right now. And would that be a complicating factor? Probably not, because you'd say, hey, if you don't want to be with the Big 12 schools, Stanford and Cal, then guess what? Too bad. You can go be an independent or you can go join the Pac-12 rebuild with Oregon State and Washington State. It's your decision. But the problem that you'd fundamentally be facing is you don't have a caliber of conference that is on par with the Big 10 and the SEC. And so if they were to go forward with this move, and I don't even know that it's getting discussed necessarily, but certainly nothing ever feels like it is off the table in this world of realignment, I think it could be fun. I think it could be interesting, but a conference that is headlined, let's presume, by the way, that Florida State and Clemson are successful in their attempts to leave the ACC. But let's say everybody else stays behind. What does a headline conference for football programs? Probably Miami, maybe North Carolina or Duke, NC State, Utah, Kansas State, TCU, Baylor. How many auto bids do you think that's going to get? For those on podcast, I'm putting up 2 fingers because that's how many it kind of feels like they will receive. I don't know that the Big 10 and SEC, who get to dictate terms to everybody, would look at that league and say, oh my gosh, well, now that there's this huge volume of teams, we got to give you a certain number of auto bids. We got to provide you with more access to the playoff. Once they get to a 14-team model, which is expected to arrive come 2026, details haven't yet fully been finalized. We know ESPN will be the primary media rights holder through 2031. That was announced and then retracted and then announced again. I think that the ACC and the Big 12 have to look at this through a lens of, okay, how do we get the most teams possible into the playoff? What structure allows us to maximize those opportunities? And they're not going to be on par with the Big 10 or the SEC. But certainly, there is still a best outcome and a worst outcome in the range of outcomes that can take place when you expand the playoff and create these auto bid situations. And I don't see how merging the leagues would change that calculus, because what I think the Big Ten and SEC are going to do is they're going to wait for Florida State and Clemson to leave the ACC. One of those leagues is going to pick them up. Maybe North Carolina or Miami will get included in that shuffle as well. And then if the ACC is still standing, which calls into mind that meme of why do you give your toughest battles to your bravest soldiers? And then it's Jesus looking at the ACC going, how are you still alive? Right? If the ACC were still hanging on right there, then the Big Ten and SEC, I think, would get them down to one bid. And perhaps they would give 2 to the Big 12 under that particular arrangement. But you take Florida State and Clemson out of the ACC, I think the Big Ten and SEC will say, that's a one bid league. That's a one big league. And I think for 2024, there's a high probability that both the Big 12 and the SEC are a one bid league. And so if for the next 2 years, I could see either league getting another team in. I just don't think it's particularly likely, especially given the depth of quality teams in the Big 12. I think they'll beat up on each other a little bit and do what, the Pac-12 did many a times and have a bunch of really good teams, but no dominant teams. So I think in the ACC, meanwhile, there is a really good possibility, not an assured one, but I think better in the Big 12, that you have a pair of 11-1 teams going at it in the conference championship game. And if that's the case, really good chance that both teams get into the playoff, especially if there's some combination of Florida State, Miami, and Clemson. But in the Big 12, can you have two teams that can get through at 11-1? I don't know. I know Utah could. I think Kansas State maybe could. You never rule out Oklahoma State. They've been in that spot before. Can Kansas make that jump, really go 11-1? That's pretty tricky. So if you take Florida State, Clemson out, I think the Big 10 in the SEC say, all right, ACC is a one bid league, and in a 14-team playoff, sure, we'll give the Big 12 two at large or two total bids, right? One auto for the conference champion, and then one other auto bid. But if they were to then merge with the ACC, I don't think the size of that league would merit them getting a fourth automatic berth. That's the way that I see it. If you feel differently, let me know in the YouTube comments. How do you feel about LSU football right now? What do they need in spring football to do what I've deemed on this show their standard for success? We'll talk about that coming up next. This episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free, which is like a super awesome price. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. That's why 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should too. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. What's needed down in Baton Rouge? Caroline Fenton of Locked On LSU joining me here on the show. Kind of an important spring for the LSU Tigers. Brian Kelly going into year 3. I think making the playoff, that is an expectation down there. Going into spring football, before we come back to that, what do you think Caroline needs to be accomplished by the Tigers?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's strange because you would think when you lose the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback and 2 of the best, if not the 2 best wide receivers in college football, you would think there might be a little bit more concern about the offense, about replacing those positions, life after Jayden Daniels. But frankly, that's not really, at least for me or a majority of the LSU fan base, the number one concern right now, because Garrett Nussmeier comes in. Well, he's been at LSU for the last 3 years, and frankly, if Garrett Nussmeier wanted to transfer last season, there would have been a lot of competitive Power 5 programs that would have gladly taken Garrett Nussmeier's assistance under center. So Garrett Nussmeier comes in. He's been waiting in the fold for the last 3 seasons. And there's a deep and stacked wide receiver room. And the question is just who's going to be the one to emerge as that next Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. or that next Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. It's not a matter of if those guys are in the room. It's which guys are they? I think the biggest concern right now and what needs to be addressed as we go throughout spring practice and once the spring transfer portal opens up, it's the defensive line. That LSU lost Mason Smith and Mekhi Wingo rather unexpectedly to the NFL draft. I know I at least expected at least one of them to leave. I didn't expect both of them to leave. And the answer, the clear-cut answer is, frankly, I don't think is currently on the roster. So they just need bodies at the defensive tackle position. Looking at guys like Sean Washington, who transferred in from JUCO, originally was committed to Georgia. He comes into LSU. Can he take that next step forward from the JUCO level to the SEC? That's what we're trying to find out in spring practice. Deshaun Womack, a former 5-star recruit, defensive tackle, was a true freshman last year. Saw a little bit of work, but was sidelined with an injury this past season. Is he fully healthy? Is he ready to take that next step forward in his second year? So at least have some names and faces to take a look at the defensive tackle position. But overall, LSU just needs depth and bodies and options on the defensive line. That's the number one concern for me.
For LSU, they remind me a lot of USC. Scoring points hasn't been the problem. It's been the other side of the ball. And the other side of the ball doesn't have to be a world beater. You don't need Georgia or Michigan or, Alabama's defenses over the years. You don't even need to be like Utah out west or Oregon or anybody like that. They just need to be serviceable, competent. So new defensive staff comes in. You talked about the defensive line, but how else does that side of the ball, that coaching staff, need to attack their weaknesses from a year ago?
Everything, every way, as much as they possibly can. Like, when you're talking about all these defenses, Utah and Alabama, like, when we talk about historically great defenses, LSU is in that conversation. Like, it is crazy to me. Like, if you would have told me, LSU fan from 2014, 15, 16, when LSU was playing games, 10-7 was the final score. When LSU was playing championship-level defense but couldn't even complete a forward pass, if you would have told me that in 2023, the roles would have been reversed, I would have been shocked and floored. LSU traditionally plays great defense. It's known as DBU for a reason. But last year, it was like everything that could have gone wrong for that defense did. It wasn't lacking talent. Harold Perkins is one of the best linebackers in all of college football. He was a complete non-factor because he was put in a position that just looked awkward, frankly. He was put in a position, game one at inside linebacker, he didn't look ready or prepared for it. Mekhi Wingo and Mason Smith, two guys that I just mentioned, two guys that I think are first-round talent in the NFL draft, but won't go in the first round because their stats aren't really popping off of the paper because they weren't put in positions to succeed. And of course, injuries are going to be a massive part of that as well, but just technically, the fundamentals for that LSU defense, it was out the window. They missed tackles. They were in the wrong places. Overall, the scheme was befuddling. Like everything that could have gone wrong last year for LSU's defense, it did. So now the big task is honestly kind of going back to the beginning. Let's go back to the basics. Let's learn how to wrap up. Like, let's learn how to tackle. Brian Kelly, just for example, for those who aren't familiar with this LSU football program, last year, LSU gave up over 700 yards to Ole Miss. 300 plus of those yards. This is per Brian Kelly.
That's not the SEC that I grew up with, Caroline. It's just not. It's just not.
Like, this is this is Golden State Warriors football. But over 300 of those yards against Ole Miss came after broken tackles, came after missed tackles. So it's honestly just getting back to the basics, and it's fitting these players back into positions that they need to be in. Sage Ryan is one guy that I'm keeping an eye on, and over the last couple of years at LSU, he's had to play safety, he's played corner, he's played in the slot, he's played nickel. He's basically just had to play wherever he's been needed because there hasn't been a ton of depth at that position. Now, fast forward, you've got more bodies, and you've got a defensive coaching staff that can figure out what he truly does best, and he can be in that role. So I think it comes down to having the players, having the depth, and having a coaching staff that puts these players in the right positions where they can succeed.
Offensively, it's hard to expect Garrett Nussmeier to, play at a Heisman Trophy level. So I think it's reasonable to expect that maybe the offense isn't quite going to be what it was last year. Won't have that next gear where they can consistently score 40 to 50 points. Still, it should be expected to be good. That's what the standard is down there. So ordinarily, if you had a new defensive staff coming in and you just lost a Heisman Trophy at quarterback, I think it's fair to temper expectations. But this is LSU, this is Brian Kelly, and this is year 3, and a 10-win season, in all likelihood, gets the Tigers into the college football playoff, whether or not they appear in the SEC title game. As spring football gets set to begin, the spring game is April 13th. Do you expect LSU to be in the playoff? Is that the standard for a successful year 3?
It's a difficult question to answer as we now expand into 12 teams, because I think all of us are looking at it like, oh, the jump from 4 to 12, that's massive. So the playoff should be the expectation. I think a 10-win SEC team gets into the 12-team play.
Have to.
And I think that another year, because LSU the last 2 years under Brian Kelly, 9 regular season wins with a bowl win, a 10-win total season. Brian Kelly has expressed, Garrett Nussmeier has expressed, the entire team has expressed, look, that's not good enough anymore, that we want to do more than just win 10 games and then find ourselves in a pretty good bowl game. We want to find ourselves in the college football playoff. So I do think, in a roundabout way, I do think that that's the expectation, assuming that 10 wins it's frankly not good enough anymore. And that's also considering that you lost the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. That's also considering that you're losing Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. That's also considering that you're losing 2 of your defensive tackles. But what LSU is returning and what LSU has proven that it can do in Brian Kelly's first 2 seasons, I think it's fair to expect that they take that next level. Because you say it might be unfair to expect LSU to score 40 points a game. Like, that's the expectation. This offense is going to look different because the run game last year, it was Jayden Daniels. The offense last year, it was Jayden Daniels. The love is going to be spread around a whole lot more. The run game is going to look different. I expect Mason Taylor, the tight end, to be a lot more involved in the passing game. But I still expect this to be an offense that can put up 35 to 40 points a game. I still expect this to be an offense that's putting up 500 yards of offense a game, because that's just, with this offensive line, returning its 2 anchors on left and right tackle side, you're returning 4 to the 5 starters on a Joe Moore Award finalist unit from last season. When you return as many receivers as you had this past season, when you go into Mason Taylor's 3rd year, when you have a quarterback in Garrett Nussmeier that, albeit doesn't have a ton of starting experience, hardly any starting experience, but is a veteran on this team and with this offense, I think those are all fair expectations.
The offense will be fun to watch in the spring game, see what receivers pop. How does Nussmeier look? But I, like many others, will be keeping an eye on that defense. And Caroline Fenton always keeping an eye on LSU. Locked On LSU on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Caroline, thanks so much for stopping by.
Appreciate you, Spencer.
So Northwestern was in a bowl game last year. Did you know that? Are they going to keep it rolling? We'll talk about that next. First, let's talk about passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and take it on the road and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. David Braun might be the most underrated or underappreciated coach in all of college football. Why? Here's why. Northwestern had a scandal come around their program that resulted in the removal of longtime head coach Pat Fitzgerald. They bottomed out in 2022. They went 1-11. 1-11. Now, last time I checked, and I check all the time, that's really bad. That's almost as bad as you could possibly be. What was Northwestern's football record last year? Do you know? Off the top of your head, did you know that they had a winning record in Big Ten conference play? Did you know that? Did you know they went 8-5? Did you know they beat a Utah team in the bowl game in the Las Vegas Bowl that, by the way, was certainly more of a home game for Utah than it was for Northwestern? Do you know they beat a team in Utah that had climbed all the way to 13th in the AP and college football playoff rankings last season. Did you know that? Did you? You probably didn't, because Northwestern isn't a program that gets a lot of eyeballs, that gets a bunch of attention, that everyone is acutely aware of. But going into 2024, David Braun has to be one of the most underrated coaches because of the job that he just did. It would have been impressive if you took that one-win team at a place like Northwestern, I'll touch on that in a moment, and took them to, I don't know, any bowl game. But to go 7-5, to have a winning record in Big Ten conference play, I mean, Michigan State didn't have that last year. Now, they also had something outside the program that was distracting them. But who's got a better football tradition in the last 10, 15 years? Michigan State or Northwestern? It's Michigan State. It obviously is. But Northwestern is ahead of where they currently are right now because of what David Braun did. And this is a guy who's got a track record of winning. Where did he come from? Who is David Braun even? Why are you talking about him, Spencer? Well, here's why. Northwestern hired David Braun from North Dakota State. If you would like to know what the closest thing to Alabama's dynasty we've ever seen is, go look at the FCS football champions from 2010 to 2020. And maybe the last several years. I don't recall off the top of my head the last time they won, but let's just say national championships are the standard for success at that program. So here's the defensive coordinator there. He goes and serves as the interim head coach. They hire him as the full-time head coach, and then boom, he goes 8-5. 8-5 after a 1-11 year. That's one of the most remarkable turnarounds we've seen. Deion Sanders took over a 1-11 Colorado team. It's one of the worst Power 5 football teams of this century. And they went 4-8. By all accounts, with their 2 non-conference wins and getting into the top 25, that was a successful first year. They just faltered down the stretch. But David Braun actually had the most overlooked and underappreciated turnaround in the entire country. Can you give me an instance anywhere else at a program that is not very easy to win at, in which you go from 1-11 to 8-5? I mean, what a year for the Wildcats. They went 5-4 in conference play. How many head coaches that are probably getting paid more than David Braun is in the Big Ten are expecting or wanting to be over 500 in Big Ten play? Well, David Braun is, as a head coach of the Northwestern Wildcats. And he's doing this at a place that admittedly doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world. Sure, we've seen him come out of the other side of the Big Ten and get to a conference championship game, once or twice here and there. But as we go forward in the Big Ten without divisions, which I think is a good thing overall for college football, it's going to be hard for Northwestern to compete. But the early returns are that David Braun is able to do more with less. Because at Northwestern, much like Stanford or Notre Dame to a degree, though not exactly the same, because you can recruit at a really high level over at Notre Dame, but you think about like a Stanford or a Cal, maybe a Duke falls into this conversation. There are academic standards that the university is dead set on upholding and adhering to consistently. So the ability for Northwestern to capitalize on such a great coaching job last year is pretty limited. And that's reflected in how 24/7 Sports evaluates their high school and transfer portal rankings. Their high school class is 79th in the country. Their transfer rank is 119th. They have added just 3 transfers, one from Texas Tech, one from Colorado, and one from, I got to be honest, I don't know what that logo actually looks like. Northwestern's 2024 incoming talent is ranked below such powerhouses on 24/7 Sports as Texas State, Toledo, Marshall, James Madison, Western Kentucky, Coastal Carolina, and Colorado State, amongst others. So this is not a place where talent acquisition is paramount, or or where you're placing a premium on, hey, can you get guys out of the portal? Can you recruit a top 100? Maybe it'll change. I think it can improve. You look at Stanford, they've pulled in a top 35 high school class, but they can't add transfers the way that everybody else can. So this is an immensely difficult job, and without the Big Ten divisions component to make it easier to reach the title game, that's going to be supremely difficult. But to look at Northwestern and say they're going to be a bad program endlessly, I don't know. kind of seems like David Braun can coach. I don't think Northwestern has ever been an easy job. Certainly they're capable of putting together winning seasons. You look at what they did with Pat Fitzgerald, and you could say it's a different world of college football. In some ways it is. But it's not as if they're incapable of, making some noise or winning games here and there that you don't think they should. They beat Wisconsin last year. Wisconsin, whose goal in the modern era is to make the playoff, maybe even get to the point where you can compete for a national championship. They're on that Penn State tier of Big Ten teams. Did you know that Northwestern went into Madison and walked out of Camp Randall with a W last year? Bet you didn't. Now you do. And you understand why I'm talking about David Braun in this positive light, because he did one heck of a job. So FanDuel has got the win total for the Wildcats of Northwestern in that lovely purple color at 5.5. That means if they go over, they make a bowl game. Well, bowl teams have been known to, make a little bit of noise. The end of the schedule is not particularly favorable. On November 16th and 23rd, they host Ohio State before they go at Michigan. That's not great. Ohio State's the better of those two teams. You get them at home, but probably too much of a roster discrepancy there. And then Michigan, who's still going to be good. How good? Not sure. Got to play them on the road at the Big House. You figure those two games are losses for the Wildcats. But here's what their schedule looks like leading up to that before a season finale with Illinois, by the way, who I think we all agree David Braun and company could absolutely beat. Miami of Ohio first, hosting Duke. There's a fascinating game. You want to talk about a battle of academic powerhouses? Northwestern and Duke. Sign me up for what that could be on the football field. Very, very interesting. You got a second-year head coach in David Braun. You got a first-year head coach in Manny Diaz. You got Malik Murphy transferring to the Blue Devils from Texas this offseason. That's a really interesting game. Northwestern's got that one at home, by the way. Then before a bye, they go at Washington. That's a Big Ten conference game. I always feel the need to remind people of that because it's strange, it's odd, it still hasn't fully set in until we watch a game like Northwestern at Washington, in which they say the Big Ten on CBS. Yeah, it's going to take some getting used to once that rolls around in the fall. But they go at Washington, who, by the way, is in a, not rebuild, but kind of a reset year. Just to kind of make a bowl game, and that'll be a solid first year to know that things will be okay with Jed Fish coming up from Arizona and whatnot. Then they host Indiana. So if my math is correct, and my eyes are still working as I glance at the schedule here, 3 of the first 4 games are at home for the Northwestern Wildcats. Trying to get into a groove for a season, trying to settle in of sorts. That's a pretty good way to do it. Then they go at Maryland, who's replacing Talia Tagovailoa. That's never going to be an easy thing to do. Mike Loxley's done some nice things out there with the Terrapins, but then they come back home and they face Wisconsin. Don't tell me they can't win that game. I know that Wisconsin's got a new quarterback and that Tyler Van Dyke came over from Miami, and you can think he's better than Tanner Mordecai. You can do all of those sorts of things, but guess what? If Northwestern won at Wisconsin, don't tell me they can't win when they've got them at home. So then they move along and they play back-to-back road games at Iowa, hard place to win. 1 possession game last year, 10-7 Big Ten barn burner between Iowa and Northwestern. They go at Purdue. Could they win that game? Yeah, they did last year. Then you go Ohio State at Michigan before closing with Illinois. So I'm looking at this schedule, and I see 10 games where Northwestern will, at the very least, have a reasonable chance of winning. 5.5 is their win total. You tell me how confident you are in the Wildcats and whether or not last year was a fluke or the new standard. And I think year 2 is going to establish that for David Braun and his staff. Was an 8-5 season, including 5-4 in Big Ten play, is that the new standard? Or was that an aberration and everything just kind of went right and they had a bunch of things click? Northwestern, an interesting team to watch in the Big Ten, to say the least. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.